All right, so now we're going to take a look at this newer model, the Keynesian model, although it's not that new. It was developed only a few decades after the classical model. But to begin this section, let's recap on classical economists. So classical economists, their world was one of fully utilized resources. And if resources weren't being fully utilized, prices would adjust so that they very quickly would become fully utilized. Now, in the 1930s, Europe and the United States entered a period of economic decline that could not be explained by the classical model, the Great Depression, right? It could not be explained by the classical model because according to the classical model, if the economy was in a bad situation, it would very quickly fix itself. But that didn't happen. During the Great Depression, we experienced a very, very poorly running economy for a long time, and the economy did not fix itself. And so at that time, this economist named John Maynard Keynes developed an explanation for why this was the case, and it became known as the Keynesian model. It was named after him. Now, Keynes' argument was that prices, including wages, were not flexible. In fact, they were inflexible or sticky downward, meaning that prices don't tend to move down, they tend to only move up. And this is particularly true with wages. Just think about your reluctance to take a lower wage, right, at a new job than what you made at your previous job. You'd be very reluctant to work for less money than you did at your previous job, right? So that's kind of the idea with sticky wages. And so if this is true, then an increase in aggregate demand will not necessarily increase the price level right away. It's going to take a good amount of time potentially if prices and wages are sticky. And furthermore, a decrease in aggregate demand would not cause firms to lower prices either. And so this led to a development of the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is something we haven't seen yet. And so this is basically the horizontal portion of the aggregate supply curve in which there is excessive unemployment and unused capacity in the economy. So some unused resources, and it's somewhat persistent. So the original short-run aggregate supply curve was horizontal, just flat. The exact opposite of what we've seen so far with supply curves. Okay, and so basically the idea is that prices are perfectly sticky, right? The price level does not change when we have increases in aggregate demand and decreases in aggregate demand. The only thing that changes is output. So here we have underutilized resources, and then here we have, I guess you could think of it as overutilized resources, although we don't really think of it that way. But that's basically what we've got. So what was going on around that time? What were real GDP and price level doing around that time? Well, Keynes argued that in a depressed economy, increased aggregate spending can increase output without increasing prices, right? Which is what we just saw in the last graph. And as a matter of fact, data showing the U.S. recovery from the Great Depression seemed to support this, right? It seemed to be supported by the data. And so in such a circumstance, real GDP is demand-driven. It's not supply-driven like in the classical model, right? And as a result, the short-run aggregate supply curve is flat, or at least almost flat. All right, so to recap, equilibrium real GDP in the Keynesian model is demand determined, whereas in the classical model, it's determined by long-run aggregate supply. Okay, so a pretty stark difference. And the Keynesian short-run aggregate supply schedule shows sources of price rigidity. So what are the causes of these sticky wages and prices? Well, some of those things were unions, right? So unions were very frequently fighting for higher wages and resisting lower wages. And on top of that, long-term contracts cause sticky prices as well, right? So firms would enter into contracts for their inputs where the price would be fixed for a long period of time, a year or more. So these are the sources of inflexibility. Now, the underlying assumption of the simplified Keynesian model that we just saw is that the relevant range of the short-run aggregate supply schedule is horizontal, right? This perfectly flat short-run aggregate supply curve. But in recent decades, the price level has drifted upwards. And so what economists have come to realize is that prices are not totally sticky. And so this has led to the development of what's called the modern Keynesian analysis, or the modern Keynesian model. And it basically just recognizes that there is some, but not total price adjustment in the short run. Okay, so prices are just partially sticky, in other words, not totally sticky. So in this modern model, the short-run aggregate supply curve is actually upward sloping, and it shows the relationship between total planned production in the economy and the price level in the short run, holding everything else constant. Now, if prices adjust somewhat but not completely, then this curve will be positively sloped. All right, before we go any further, let's stop to think about an interesting example: why U.S. nominal wages have been slow to adjust, why they have been sticky to some degree. Now, in recent years, men have lagged behind women in obtaining education and training. Interesting to know. And thus, men have sought employment in markets for lower skilled labor. And because of this, average wages earned by male workers has declined, even as women's average wages have gone up. And to some degree, this explains why average wages across both male and female workers have hardly increased. Men's wages have been suppressed or going down, while women's have been going up. So on average, they have mostly stayed the same. Okay, so here's a comparison of the original Keynesian model where prices are perfectly sticky, no movement in prices, and real GDP is being driven by aggregate demand by itself, compared with the modern Keynesian model where we see that in the short-run aggregate supply curve, prices are somewhat sticky, but not totally. Okay, so we get this upward sloping curve. So when we have this positively sloped short-run aggregate supply curve, demand will now lead to some change in price level, even in the short run. It also still drives GDP to some degree. All right, so in the modern Keynesian short run, when the price level rises partially, real GDP can expand beyond the level that's consistent with its long-run growth path and long-run aggregate supply. And the reason for this is because most labor contracts will allow for some flexibility in the total number of hours worked. So, sometimes you can work overtime. A full-time worker might sometimes work 35 hours instead of 40, so there's some flexibility there. And in addition to that, another reason is because the capital stock, right, the machinery and factories that are in place can be used to different degrees of intensity. Okay, so they can be used more intensely when prices go up, right? If prices go up, that incentivizes firms to try to squeeze more product out of their factories and machinery by using them more intensely. Now, if wages are constant when prices go up, the firm ends up being more profitable, right? And all of these adjustments cause real GDP to rise as the price level increases. Firms use workers more intensively, so getting them to work harder, more hours per week, and use that capital more intensively as well, right? Using machines for longer periods of time during the day, perhaps. And again, if wages are held constant, then these higher prices lead to increased profits, which leads to lower unemployment as firms begin to hire more employees. Okay, so interesting progression of events. Okay, so that was an introduction to the Keynesian model. In the next section, we're going to talk about shifts in the aggregate supply curves.